The questions that have brought warfare and bitterness to the Middle East for the last 30 years will not be settled overnight. But we should all recognize the substantial achievements that have been made.
The substantial achievements that President Jimmy Carter is talking about here were the Camp David Accords. On September 5th of 1978, U.S. President Jimmy Carter brought together Egyptian Prime Minister Anwar al-Sadat and Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin at Camp David, Maryland, a presidential retreat, to begin speaking of a peace process in the Middle East between the two countries. A year earlier, in 1977, Sadat flew to Israel to give a speech to Begin and the Israeli parliament. Following his trip, Begin traveled to Egypt to speak. However, this meeting did not go as expected. Both Sadat and Begin were dissatisfied with the result. The entire world was stunned by the interaction between these two countries, who had been at war for 30 years. The Arab world was not only surprised but angry at Sadat for having anything to do with Israel. The president of Syria announced that November 19, 1977, the day Sadat flew to Jerusalem, was to be a day of mourning. Then Libya closed all air traffic and sea traffic between Egypt, barring any Egyptian ships from Libyan docks and Egyptian planes from Libyan airports. The first Egyptian-Israeli talks did not seem very successful. Negotiations did not appear to be going anywhere, so Carter came in to repair the damage. In the Nobel Prize speech for the Camp David Accords, it is said that the master builder responsible for the bridge that had to be built between Egypt and Israel, in order that these two one-time enemy nations should have any opportunity of coming together to frame an agreement, was the President of the United States of America, Jimmy Carter. When the original negotiations appeared to be failing, Carter invited the Middle Eastern leaders to America where he could broker their agreement. For 12 days, between September 5th and September 17th, the three leaders discussed how to form the Accords. And according to Don Peretz, writer of the Encyclopedia on the Middle East and North Africa, Sadat and Begin's acrimonious relationship threatened to derail the conference, but President Carter's personal intervention saved it from failure. After this week and a half of talking, two final accords were settled upon and signed by all three leaders and their top officers on the 17th. They were called A Framework for Peace in the Middle East and A Framework for the Conclusion of a Peace Treaty between Egypt and Israel. This is a prime example of the course theme Power, Authority, and Leadership. Here, America uses its influential power to bring two warring countries together to sit down, discuss, and come up with a solution to bring peace between them. The Framework for Middle Eastern Peace outlined a plan for the Palestinian problem in which they were to be given autonomy. Israel and Egypt agreed on a 5-year transitional period in which Israeli forces and settlements would be moved out of the land that was to be Palestinian. Also during this time, the Palestinians were to democratically elect their own government to rule their own autonomous West Bank.
And the need to resolve the Palestinian problem in all its aspects. The framework document proposes a 5-year transitional period in the West Bank and Gaza, during which the Israeli military government will be withdrawn and a self-governing authority will be elected with full autonomy.
However, upon hearing of this, the Palestinians were angered. Despite the fact that they had been considered while reshaping the Middle East, they were outraged at the fact that no Palestinian representative was present during the negotiations. Therefore, this accord fell through and never went into execution. It essentially had failed. The second accord, a framework for the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty conclusion, was much more successful than its brother accord. This agreement dictated the basis on which an Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty was to be written up, documented, and signed. 1 year later, in March of 1979, this exact plan went into action, and Sadat and Begin signed a peace treaty between their respective countries. A major step towards bringing peace to a region that had endured over 3 decades of warfare and violence. Another course theme is prevalent here: conflict and consensus. For over 30 years, Egypt and Israel have been at war, their conflict, but when they sit down to talk, they come to a consensus on how to establish peace among them. For their negotiations and peace agreements, the Camp David Accords and the Egyptian-Israeli Peace Treaty, In October of 1979, it was announced that Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin were to be given the Nobel Peace Prize. And on December 10th of that same year, they both gave their lectures and were awarded for being the brave men to take the first steps towards ending the conflict in a region with a long history of it. After his Nobel Prize award for peace, Sadat had a rough time managing his own country, half of whom did not want to even have negotiated peace with Israel in the first place. At a military celebration on October 6, 1981, Sadat was assassinated by 3 radicals for his treaty with Israel, the first Arab leader to step foot in Jerusalem and the first to talk to and negotiate peace with Israel had been killed soon thereafter. Jimmy Carter did not have too successful of a presidency. His administration was embarrassed with the Iranian hostage crisis, and the American economy was slowly declining throughout the time he was in office. Sadly, Carter was not re-elected in 1980, but despite his blunders, he will be remembered for his part in the Camp David Accords, for they could have not happened without him. These accords and the peace treaty they brought were a momentous achievement. Never before had any steps toward peace been taken in the Middle East, and Jimmy Carter was the broker who made it all happen. And the Camp David Accords would become one of the high points of Carter's presidency.